Hello everybody. So today I'm going to be talking about freedom of speech and the idea that's been pushed by certain groups that Jimmy Kimmel's suspension and his firing, which was undone 6 days later, was a freedom of speech issue, and that it shows that USA is now in the midst of a freedom of speech crisis. So I saw that on the news here in Australia, where we don't have the same level of freedom of speech that America does. Why does it even matter to us if they're having freedom of speech issues? I don't know. We just decide that it matters. Anyway, I'll just note that here in Australia, I believe we've just introduced a law that it's called something like the Child Safety Online Act or something along those lines. And essentially, if you're under a certain age, I believe it's under 16, you have to, you're not allowed to go onto social media at all. At all. So, and if you're over 16, you have to prove you're over 16 in order to go on. So, you need ID to access, Facebook, Twitter. They're the only ones that I use. Although YouTube, they have considered YouTube to be social media, and YouTube don't consider themselves to be social media. But according to the Australian government, at least as far as this is concerned, it does include YouTube. And they also got things like Instagram, and I don't even know what else is out there, but anyway, whatever counts as social media and by whatever definition. So that is censorship and freedom of speech violations. Granted, it's only affecting younger people, but suffice to say, pretty sure you wouldn't be allowed to have that law in America. And a lot of Americans have said, no, that law would not be legal in America. All right, so Americans are known to have the most free freedom of speech laws in the world. In fact, they're about as free as you can possibly get. So essentially, they're allowed to say just about whatever they like, as long as it's not defamation. They can even lie, as long as those lies do not get to the level of defamation. That's pretty much it. Now, of course, private companies can decide for themselves if they allow you to speak on their server in certain areas, and they can pretty much ban you, restrict you, delete things for any reason they feel like it. And that's not explicitly covered, but it can be. And I'll get into that in a minute. But essentially, they can pretty much say whatever they like. And they can even defame elected officials and public figures. So as long as you meet the criteria for a public figure, they're allowed to lie about you like crazy. Like crazy. Now, there are still limits, but how much you can lie about a private individual is a lot less than how much you can lie about a public figure. And in fact, you can still lie quite a lot about a private individual. And I go over defamation laws sometimes, but the standard for a lie to be defamation is very high. Like, it has to be really bad for it to be defamation. It has to be even worse for public figures. And if it's an elected official, let alone the president, it has to be so high that it's insane. And in fact, I don't even know of a case where someone lying about an elected official was considered defamation. I don't even know if it's possible in practice. It's not even possible in Australia, let alone in America. So they can lie like crazy, and if, let alone if it's the president. They can just say whatever they feel like about the president, and it's not defamation. So, because they're electing them. So they can just lie. Now, incidentally, politicians are allowed to lie back. So politicians can just generally lie non-stop. Well, that's the case in Australia, that's the case in America. They can just lie like non-stop, and they're not allowed to do anything about it. So the most you can do is you can say, well, that was a lie. But that whole thing, where they were fact-checking Donald Trump, they're not really allowed to do that. Like, sort of allowed to, but not really. Like, because that's actually a breach of freedom of speech. His freedom of speech, because it doesn't actually matter if he's lying. They're not allowed to fact check it while he's on doing it. They broke the rules of debates by fact-checking him. That is not what the mediator is supposed to do. That's what the opposition is supposed to do. So they've already broken all sorts of freedom of speech laws in relation to Donald Trump. And they're extremely inconsistent because they're not doing that to anyone else. And it's not like he's the only politician that lies. And in fact, we've gone over this several times. He's actually what we call an honest liar, in that his lies are obvious. So we used to have a politician here in Australia called Kim Beazley. It was a Labor Party, left-sided politician. And he was an honest liar. And so he was very obvious when he was lying. And sometimes people get confused because when they hear an honest liar, they assume that they're lying about more things than what they're obviously lying about, and they're not. Whereas the person that you don't think is lying, the politician at least, is probably lying about all sorts of things on top of that. So we can actually demonstrate that Donald Trump lies less than, for example, Joe Biden. And could probably say other career politicians. And the more embedded they are, the more they lie, and the more they know how to sneakily lie. They learn this. So, yeah, he does lie sometimes. I'm not going to say he never lies, but he's not lying as much as some of the others. In fact, I'd probably say he's probably one of the most honest ones, if not the most honest, in American politics. And I know that sounds harsh when you say, no, but we've caught him out on hundreds of lies. Yeah, but there'd be thousands for the others. So it's a factor. I'm not just saying, oh, Democrats lie and Republicans don't. No, Republicans lie like crazy too. But he doesn't as much as the others. So anyway, there's a number of freedom of speech issues relating to how he's been treated. But if you oppose him, you're not aware of that. You're not considering that. Because you're thinking, well, we're allowed to tell a politician that they're lying. Well, we are. But we've got to be consistent. And they're not telling other politicians that they're lying, just him. And it's not actually because he's lying more, because he's actually lying less. So this is a political thing. This is a dishonest thing. This is a corruption thing. This is a freedom of speech thing. The freedom of speech actually allows him to lie like crazy. And in fact, any politician. We actually have that here in Australia. Any politician speaking under parliamentary privilege can lie like crazy. And they're allowed to, and they can't. It's not defamation. And that's the case for him as well. And while there's no explicit law banning them from saying that he's lying and stopping him while they're interviewing him, implicitly they can't. So there's a lot of issues with that. Now, I pointed that out at the time that was happening. Nobody really seemed to be caring. But it is a pretty big issue. But now let's get back to what I was going to talk about, which is Jimmy Kimmel. So Jimmy Kimmel gave a monologue 2 weeks ago, I think it was, and this was about Charlie Kirk's death. Now, it's notable that he had already, before that, he had made a tweet on Twitter, or X, I refuse to call it X, and he'd said, my condolences to Charlie Kirk's widow and his family. It was along those lines. So he didn't celebrate Charlie Kirk's death, which also, I'd argue, you should be allowed to celebrate someone's death if you don't like them. So he didn't celebrate his death. He actually offered condolences. But in his monologue, now I'm not going to quote it exactly, but it was along the lines of, they are doing everything they can to make it sound like Charlie Kirk's killer is not a MAGA Republican. Now, people have said that doesn't mean he's calling him a MAGA Republican. Well, it does. There's no other way to interpret that. You can't interpret that any other way than saying Tyler Robinson is a MAGA Republican. Now, notably, there are some people that have said that he wasn't a MAGA Republican, and some people have even said he wasn't the killer. So Candace Owens, who's generally a conservative, massive conspiracy theorist, and talks a load of nonsense most of the time, I find her very unbelievable for almost everything she says, and she's just one of these people that just says stuff just just upset people, just to get people talking. And she's got a lawsuit against her from Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, because she accused his wife, Brigitte Macron, of being a man. Now, I'd argue she cannot be prosecuted because she's not believable. And that's actually a defence in defamation law. And there were a number of newspapers and magazines over the years who posted a load of nonsense constantly, such that they weren't believable. And they couldn't be sued for defamation. Well, they still could in theory, but the bar became so high because they just weren't believable. So Candace Owens, because she lies, well, I shouldn't say she lies, but she says things that are so ridiculous so often, she effectively can't be sued for defamation. And in fact, that's a tip. If you want to start defaming people, I shouldn't say that. But essentially, if you're not believable, you probably can't defame someone because people are not going to believe you. And this is similar why I think that that guy that said the Sandy Cook, the Infowars, what's his name, Alex Jones? I don't think he should have been found guilty because he was not believable. And I don't think very many people actually believed him. He lost. I think that was a mistake by the courts. But anyway, Jimmy Kimmel, on the other hand, is someone that is believable. He is believed. People readily accepted that what he said was true. So when he said that, people were saying, oh, Tyler Robinson's a MAGA Republican. And they look into it and they go, oh, well, his dad's a MAGA Republican. His whole family are. Therefore, he is. Therefore, Charlie Kirk was killed by one of his own. Wasn't politically motivated. Or, alternatively, he was killed because he wasn't Republican enough or was too Republican. You know, and I wanted to note back to Thomas Crooks, who was the guy that died and tried to assassinate Donald Trump, or certainly looked that way, and ended up shooting his ear. And if Trump hadn't turned his head just at the right moment, would have killed him. Now, Thomas Crooks was a Republican, but he viewed that Donald Trump was too much of a Republican, that was too far to the right, so he wanted to kill him. He said he didn't think that Donald Trump represented true Republicans. But the problem is, MAGA Republican essentially means far right. Charlie Kirk was about as far right as you can get. And he actually was friends with Donald Trump. So suggesting that he was killed for not being far right enough is ridiculous. And if you were someone that was on the far right, which we imply by saying MAGA Republican, you shouldn't be killing them because they're on they're too far right or they're not far. They should align pretty much perfectly. So that is a major defamatory claim. It's a dishonest claim. And it doesn't align with what has been officially released. Now, if you want to say, okay, you agree with Candace Owens, you think, oh, Tyler Robinson was innocent. It was actually Erica Kirk who killed him. He was killed by his wife. That's what she's been saying. I haven't actually heard her thing, but I believe it's along those lines. And of course, there's other people that have got other different conspiracy theories. They say he's still alive, blah, blah, blah. So if we think that if we're going from the perspective that what Jimmy Kimmel said was meant to be taken as a conspiracy theory, suggesting that the government was lying and he's going to support whichever conspiracy theory he feels like supporting, he didn't specify which one or go into any details, then that's different. But he presented it as if it was fact, something that was demonstrably false. And it is defamation. I know a lot of people say, oh, but you can't defame a dead person. Well, you can, as long as that dead person is making money. Now, most dead people don't make money, but some do, particularly certain, like famous people. For example, I'd say Walt Disney is still making money. His company, Disney, still exists, still makes money. And they also make money out of his reputation. So if someone were to defame Walt Disney today, you'd have to do it in a certain way. They could potentially be sued for defamation from the Disney company. Now, equally, Steve Irwin, he died, and his wife, his son, his daughter, they're all making money out of his name, his image, and also Australia Zoo, probably his father as well. So if you were to defame Steve Irwin today, they could all sue you. Australia Zoo could sue you, the father could sue you, the wife could sue you, the father, son and daughter, probably all together. So being dead doesn't make you immune to defamation law. It actually doesn't. And the fact that he has a company called Turning Point USA, which is now being run by his wife, means his wife could sue. In fact, his wife could sue separately by herself anyway. And a whole bunch of other people could sue because of that lie. Now, this wasn't a mistake, because Jimmy Kimmel was aware of the facts before he made that statement. Now, the other side is that there's people claiming, including Jimmy Kimmel himself, they've claimed, oh no, he was fired because he criticised Donald Trump. Now, this refers to the second part of the monologue. In the second part of the monologue, Jimmy Kimmel actually showed Donald Trump talking about Charlie Kirk dying, not shedding a tear, and then talking about buildings. And Jimmy Kimmel said, oh, that's not how a grown man grieves. That's how a little kid grieves when their pet turtle dies. Now, the implication, of course, is that Trump wasn't actually upset about Kirk dying, that he wanted him to die, which could be defamatory against Donald Trump, except that Donald Trump is the president, an elected official, so you're allowed to say that. He's allowed to say that. So that's not defamatory. It's rude, but it's also what is the big problem, is that it's making fun of people who grieve. Because not everybody grieves by crying. Like, I know you're supposed to, somebody dies, you cry. And I can tell you, I've had 4 grandparents die, and how I reacted to each of the 4 was different. When my first grandfather died, when I was 12 years old, he died after a 10-year battle with bone cancer, and he said he was ready to go, and I was like, good, you're at peace. I did not cry. You know, so what sort of a heartless person doesn't cry at their own grandfather's funeral? But I was happy that he was out of pain. You see, so, I mean, I had, the one grandparent that died that I did get upset with was the one that died. She had Alzheimer's, and they stopped feeding her and she'd starved to death. I died because that was against her wishes, because she wanted to just keep going. And that upset me. It also upset me that I couldn't go to the funeral. I got the first flight I could, and they had the funeral the day before. And that really upset me. So why did that one upset me and the other one not? Circumstances. And everybody reacts to grieving differently. And it doesn't mean you're not upset. It doesn't mean you're not sad that they're dead. And making fun of someone's grieving process is heartless and cruel. Now, it's not defamation. But I would argue that if ABC America were aware of how heartless that was, and that was just so heartless, it was ridiculous. It was heartless not just to Donald Trump, who cares, he's a politician, but to every person that was grieving over Charlie Kirk, or any person that's grieving ever over anything. They would have every right to fire him because he's a heartless jerk. Right? Now, he could say, oh, that's freedom of speech. And legally he is allowed to say that, but they're also allowed to fire him for being a heartless jerk. However, it's not why they fired him. They fired him for the first part, because what he said was such an outrageous lie about the killer being obviously a MAGA Republican, and it was so defamatory to Charlie Kirk, his family, his foundation, everything related to him, that they felt that they could no longer safely have Jimmy Kimmel on the show, because he was exposing them to defamation. Because if you sue for defamation, they would be suing not only Jimmy Kimmel, but also the network, and potentially they're all the way down. Their owners. Because when you sue for defamation, you can sue just for one person, but if they are given a platform, you'll also sue the platform. And you might sue the platform's owners and so forth. So ABC America decided that the risk was too great, and so they fired him. They brought it back later, which they're also allowed to do. They brought him back later because I guess they thought it was no longer a risk. He did not apologise. He did not admit to anything. He instead said it wasn't about Charlie Kirk, it was about Donald Trump. Now, that was a lie. It was definitely about Charlie Kirk. But in saying that, it sort of removed the ability for them to sue him. Even though he was lying about it being freedom of speech and all that sort of stuff, it still removed the ability for them to be fearful. Now, it is notable that Nexstar and Sinclair, some of their affiliate stations, are still not airing the Jimmy Kimmel Show. That's also their right. And what does this have to do with freedom of speech? Well, the false allegation, it's completely false, is that Donald Trump said to them, oh, fire them, said to the FCC, who said to Nexstar and Sinclair, who said to ABC, or did they say to Disney and then to ABC America, fire him, fire him, fire him, fire him, and they all went along with it. Now, if that's the case, if that is what happened, and again, there's no evidence that happened, none of these people have said that that's what happened. Jimmy Kimmel said it, but that's a conspiracy theory, that's not fact. It might be true, but we don't know that it's true. We've got to be careful about accepting conspiracy theories as fact. They might be true, but we've got no proof for it. I mean, if ABC America said, yeah, we actually fired him because Donald Trump told us to, which incidentally is what YouTube, Facebook and Twitter have said, that they were forced to ban people by the government. They've said that now. If they'd said that, then yes, that would be an issue. They haven't said that. In fact, they've said, no, it was for the other bit. But even if that was the case, even if Donald Trump said, oh, I'm outraged by this, then they said, oh, we're outraged by this, it's still not a freedom of speech issue, because you can still argue that that second part wasn't just defamatory to Donald Trump, and legally you can't defame him because he's the president and he's an elected official, but it was actually defamatory to everybody, or at least insulting. Probably not defamatory, that's probably the wrong term, but it's definitely insulting to everybody who's ever grieved, especially anybody who's grieving over Charlie Kirk. It's insensitive, and you're allowed to fire someone for being insensitive. Because when you're employed anywhere, you have to represent the company that hires you, and it doesn't have to be defamatory. It can just be they don't like what you're saying. You're not representing what they want to project, and they're allowed to do that. That's not a freedom of speech issue. He can have a freedom of speech issue. He can say those things whenever he feels like it, on his own, but not on that platform. So this is not a freedom of speech issue. And the funny thing is, this is coming at a time when YouTube have just announced that they were forced to ban people and suppress people who disagreed with Joe Biden while Joe Biden was president, which is a freedom of speech issue. So we've got an actual freedom of speech issue that, we don't want to talk about. And then they're talking about something that's not a freedom of speech issue at all. Yeah, anyway, that's it from me. Bye-bye now.